Hey guys, tonight we begin with the divine chaos and cosmic road trip that is the ancient Greek epic, the Odyssey. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's begin with Odysseus, the ancient Greek hero and perpetual guy who refuses to ask for directions. Odysseus wasn't just some warrior with a nice helmet. He was the king of Ithaca, the brains behind the Trojan horse, and the living embodiment of taking the scenic route home. For 10 years, he fought a brutal war in Troy, and then for another 10 years, he tried to get back to his house, which, by ancient Greek standards, was probably just a few islands over. No GPS, no travel insurance, and a serious lack of reliable ferry services. He was, in essence, the original victim of a catastrophic airline delay, except his delay involved one-eyed giants, angry gods, and a witch who turned his friends into barnyard animals. By day, Odysseus was supposed to be sailing home, providing leadership, and not getting his entire crew killed. But most days, oh, you thought he made progress? No. Instead, Odysseus was usually getting shipwrecked, cursed, or held captive on a beautiful island by a goddess who found his whole world-weary survivor vibe irresistible. His commute from the office, in this case, a decade-long siege, was less of a commute and more of a mythological horror show. He had to outsmart monsters, navigate past whirlpools that could swallow his entire ship, and constantly explain to angry deities why he was so special. Imagine finishing a 10-year project only to be told your trip home will take another 10 years and will feature a 100% chance of sea monsters and divine retribution. To keep things from getting completely hopeless, Odysseus had a crew of assorted Greek soldiers. Think of them like celestial interns, but instead of fetching coffee, they mostly opened cursed bags of wind and ate sacred cows they were explicitly told not to eat. Workplace drama alert. Among his divine helpers was Athena, the goddess of wisdom, who had a massive soft spot for him and acted like his celestial life coach, occasionally swooping in to give advice or disguise him as an old man. But it gets weirder. At some point, Odysseus's journey stopped being about getting home and started being a tour of every cursed island in the Aegean. Why? Because he, in a moment of classic heroic ego, blinded a Cyclops and then made sure to tell the giant his full name, address, and social security number. The Cyclops' father just happened to be Poseidon, the god of the sea. After that HR disaster, Odysseus took a step back from making good decisions and mostly just tried to survive, letting his crew pick up the slack, which they were spectacularly bad at. The Olympian gods, the celestial board of directors for planet Earth, a family unit with the emotional stability of a reality TV show cast. Basically, if you've ever felt simultaneously all-powerful, betrayed by a sibling, and mildly concerned with the love lives of mortals, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with ancient Greece's favorite dysfunctional family. Zeus started out strong, king of the gods, wielder of lightning, master of the sky. He brought order to the cosmos, defeated the Titans, so obviously a legend. People respected him, which, as history shows, is a fast track to developing a serious complex and an inability to keep it in his toga. Enter Hera, his wife, sister, nemesis, and the poster child for righteous fury with a divine expense account. Hera's jealousy wasn't subtle. She literally spent most of her immortal existence hunting down Zeus's various mistresses and their unfortunate offspring. Imagine finding out your husband cheated, and your response is to invent a new kind of monster to torment his child for the next several centuries. Overkill much. And then there's Poseidon, brother of Zeus, god of the sea, and the divine equivalent of a guy who owns a massive truck and has serious anger management issues. He didn't just control the oceans, he held grudges. He could be calm and benevolent 1 minute, offering safe passage, and the next, he's unleashing a kraken because some sailor looked at him funny. He was in charge of earthquakes, storms, and a surprising number of horses, because nothing says Lord of the Deep like a well-maintained stable. But the real drama wasn't just between the big three. There was Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, who sprang fully formed from Zeus's head after he complained of a headache. Yes, a divine migraine baby. She was brilliant, strategic, and the ultimate celestial favorite, the kind of daughter who gets a 4.0 in cosmic law and also captains the varsity smiting team. She was Odysseus's main patron, his guardian angel with a spear, constantly intervening to save him from his own terrible choices, like a divine publicist cleaning up after a celebrity scandal. Her biggest rival was often Poseidon, especially since she beat him in the contest to become the patron deity of Athens by inventing the olive tree, which is objectively more useful than a saltwater spring. The gods weren't just distant rulers. They were active participants, micromanagers of the mortal realm. They took sides in wars, disguised themselves to walk among humans, and meddled in family affairs with the subtlety of a lightning bolt to the face. They were petty, vain, and prone to catastrophic overreactions, but they were also forces of nature, embodiments of love, war, wisdom, and the chaotic, unpredictable energy that governed the world. Moral of the story: never accept a gift from a god. Always assume your king is secretly a deity in disguise. And sometimes the best way to run the universe is to run it like a high-stakes family drama. The war was over. Troy, the great city, was a smoking ruin, a testament to 10 years of brutal, grinding conflict, and one very clever, very large wooden horse. For Odysseus, king of Ithaca, the taste of victory was mingling with the salt of the sea and the deep, aching desire for home. He gathered his remaining men, the hardened survivors of a decade of bloodshed, onto his fleet of 12 black ships. They were not boys anymore. They were ghosts, their faces etched with the memories of fallen comrades and a city burned to the ground. The journey home should have been a straight shot across the Aegean, a triumphant return. But the gods, in their infinite and often cruel wisdom, had other plans. Their first stop was Ismarus, the land of the Cicones. Hubris, the fatal flaw of so many heroes, was running high. Flushed with the victory at Troy, Odysseus and his men saw the city not as a place of potential rest, but as another prize to be taken. They sacked the city with ruthless efficiency, a final bloody echo of the war they had just left. They plundered, they killed the men, and they enslaved the women, their hearts still hardened by the cold logic of war. Odysseus, even then, felt a flicker of unease. He urged his men to take what they needed and leave quickly, to retreat to the ships before their luck ran out. But the men were deaf to his warnings. They were drunk on wine and victory, feasting on the spoils of their raid, laughing on the shores of a conquered land. They believed they were invincible. They had forgotten that the world was larger than the battlefield of Troy, that every action has a consequence. As they feasted, survivors from the inland Cicones gathered reinforcements. They were not the coastal traders Odysseus's men had slaughtered. They were skilled warriors fighting on their home turf. At dawn, they counterattacked. They swarmed the beach, as numerous as the leaves and flowers in spring. The Greeks, groggy from wine and bloated with arrogance, were caught completely by surprise. A fierce battle erupted on the sands. The tide of war, which had been in their favor for so long, had turned against them. Spears flew, bronze armor rang with the clash of swords, and the beach began to run red. Odysseus rallied his men, fighting with the desperate courage of a cornered lion. But it was not enough. The Cicones were relentless. For everyone that fell, 2 more seemed to rise from the rolling hills. By the time Odysseus and his men were forced back to their ships, a retreat as panicked and bloody as their assault had been arrogant, the cost was clear. 6 men from each of his 12 ships were dead, their bodies left behind on the blood-soaked sand. A heavy silence fell over the fleet as they pushed out to sea. The cheers of victory replaced by the cries of mourning for their fallen comrades. It was their first stop on the journey home, and already it was a disaster. The gods were teaching them a lesson. The war was over, but the world was still a dangerous place, and their arrogance was a heavier burden than any treasure they had plundered. After the bloody lesson at Ismarus, a great storm, sent by a displeased Zeus, descended upon the fleet. For 9 days and 9 nights, they were driven off course by furious winds, their sails torn to shreds, their oarsmen exhausted. The sea and sky merged into a single gray tempest, and all sense of direction was lost. The men huddled in the hulls of their ships, their earlier arrogance washed away by the relentless fury of the sea. They were no longer conquerors. They were just men, small and fragile, against the wrath of the gods. When the storm finally broke on the 10th day, they found themselves in a strange, unknown land. The sun beat down on a coastline of lush, hypnotic beauty. The air was warm and heavy, with the scent of strange, sweet flowers. This was the land of the Lotus-Eaters, a place that promised peace, a gentle respite from the horrors of war and the violence of the sea. Odysseus, ever cautious, anchored his fleet and sent 3 of his men ashore to scout the area and see what kind of people lived there. He instructed them to be wary, to learn what they could, and to return quickly. The 3 scouts ventured inland and soon came upon the natives, the Lotus-Eaters. They were not hostile or warlike. They were gentle, smiling people, their eyes hazy with a placid contentment. They greeted the Greeks not with weapons, but with their most prized possession, the lotus fruit. It was a flower of intoxicating sweetness, and they offered it freely to the weary travelers. The scouts, hungry and exhausted from their ordeal at sea, accepted the gift without suspicion. The moment the honey-sweet fruit touched their tongues, a profound change came over them. A warm, blissful languor spread through their limbs. The sharp edges of their memories began to soften and blur. The horrors of Troy, the blood on the beaches of Ismarus, the terror of the storm, it all faded away, replaced by a deep, numbing calm. Their desire for home, the faces of their wives and children, the very name of Ithaca, dissolved like smoke. All they wanted was to stay in this peaceful land forever, to eat the lotus fruit and drift in a sea of mindless, painless bliss. Back on the ship, Odysseus waited. Hours passed, and his men did not return. A knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He knew something was wrong. Taking a handful of his most loyal men, he went ashore himself to find his lost scouts. He found them among the Lotus-Eaters, sitting with vacant smiles on their faces, dreamily plucking more of the narcotic fruit from the plants. They did not recognize him. When he called their names, they looked at him with the placid indifference of strangers. When he spoke of Ithaca, of home, they showed no flicker of recognition. Their will was gone, consumed by the lotus. Odysseus realized the terrible danger of this place. It was not a danger of swords or monsters, but of the soul. This land offered an escape so complete that it erased who you were. With a heavy heart, he and his loyal men had to use force. They dragged the 3 weeping, protesting scouts back to the ship, their minds still lost in the fog of the lotus. They tied them securely beneath the rowing benches, their cries echoing across the calm water as they begged to be returned to their state of blissful ignorance. Odysseus ordered the rest of his crew to board the ships immediately and to push off from that accursed shore. He knew that if any more of his men tasted the lotus, his entire fleet would be lost, not to a storm or a battle, but to the seductive promise of forgetting. As they sailed away, the sweet scent of the lotus flowers followed them for a time, a haunting reminder of a peace that was more dangerous than any war. Let's talk about the Cyclops, specifically Polyphemus. Basically, if you've ever felt simultaneously like a reclusive artisan, a misunderstood giant, and a victim of a very rude home invasion, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with ancient Greece's favorite one-eyed bachelor. Polyphemus started out with a pretty sweet deal. He was the son of Poseidon, had his own private island, a flock of sheep that were probably great listeners, and a thriving cheese-making business. He was living the ultimate off-the-grid, self-sufficient lifestyle. He didn't have to deal with neighbors, city council meetings, or the tedious obligations of Greek social etiquette. He was, in essence, a giant hermit with a passion for dairy, which, as lifestyles go, is fairly unproblematic. People feared him, which, as history shows, is a fast track to being left alone to perfect your feta recipe. Enter Odysseus, his crew of hungry sailors, and the ancient Greek concept of xenia, or hospitality, which was basically the divine version of an Airbnb review system with much higher stakes. Odysseus, in a move that can only be described as peak tourist entitlement, decided to just walk into the Cyclops' cave, uninvited, and start helping himself to the cheese. He and his men made themselves at home, lit a fire, and waited for the owner to return, fully expecting to be treated as honored guests. This is the ancient world equivalent of breaking into someone's house, eating all their food, and then being shocked when they're not happy to see you. Polyphemus's reaction wasn't subtle. He literally sealed the cave entrance with a boulder the size of a small house, grabbed 2 of Odysseus's men, and ate them. Raw. Imagine coming home from a long day of shepherding, only to find a bunch of strangers having a picnic in your living room, and then everyone acts surprised when you're not in the mood to be a gracious host. The whole situation was a PR disaster for Polyphemus. He gets painted as the villain, the savage monster, but from his perspective, He was just defending his property from a bunch of armed intruders. Sure, his method of conflict resolution was a bit extreme, but this was a world without a formal legal system. His cave, his rules, and his rules apparently included a very strict no trespassing policy enforced by cannibalism. The ensuing drama with the blinding and the nobody trick was just an escalation of this initial misunderstanding. He was a simple giant living a simple life, and then Odysseus brought all his Trojan war baggage and his clever hero complex right to his front door. Polyphemus wasn't evil. He was just a socially awkward giant who reacted very, very poorly to unannounced visitors. Moral of the story: never assume someone's home is a public rest stop. Always call ahead before you visit a giant. And sometimes, the best way to run a successful cheese-making operation is to have a reputation for eating your customers. The island was rugged and wild, a stark contrast to the hypnotic shores of the Lotus-Eaters. It was dominated by a great mountain, and the smoke of a distant fire suggested it was inhabited. Odysseus, driven by a relentless curiosity that so often bordered on recklessness, decided he had to investigate. He left most of his fleet behind in the harbor of a nearby deserted island, a goat-infested paradise that provided his men with a much-needed feast. But the next morning, he took his own ship and his most trusted crew, along with a goatskin of powerful, unmixed wine, a gift from a priest he had spared at Ismarus, and set out for the mainland. A sense of foreboding hung in the air, a premonition that this particular exploration would come at a high cost. They landed on the shore and made their way towards a large cave, set high in the cliffside and surrounded by a courtyard of massive stones. It was clearly the home of someone or something of immense size and strength. The entrance to the cave was vast, a gaping mouth in the rock face, and from within came the smell of livestock and sour milk. Odysseus chose 12 of his best men to accompany him. He should have been cautious, but the laws of Xenia, the sacred duty of hospitality, made him bold. He believed that no creature, man or monster, would dare to harm a guest for fear of angering the gods. It was a faith that would soon be brutally shattered. They entered the cave. The interior was cavernous, the ceiling lost in shadow. Pens filled with lambs and kids were sectioned off along the walls, and racks of woven baskets overflowed with giant cheeses. Vats of whey stood cooling in the dim light. The owner was clearly a shepherd, a master of his craft, but he was nowhere to be seen. His men, their nerves on edge, urged Odysseus to take some of the cheese and lambs and retreat quickly to the ship. It was the sensible thing to do, but Odysseus refused. His pride and his curiosity were a dangerous combination. He wanted to meet the owner of this strange place, to see what gifts of hospitality he might offer. So they lit a fire, made an offering to the gods, and sat down to eat some of the cheese, waiting in the deepening gloom of the cave. As dusk fell, a shadow fell across the entrance, and the ground trembled with the weight of heavy footfalls. The Cyclops returned. He was a terrifying sight, a monstrous giant with a single glaring eye in the center of his forehead. He carried a massive load of firewood on his back, which he threw to the ground with a deafening crash. Then, with an effortless display of strength, he rolled a colossal boulder over the entrance of the cave, sealing them inside. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the flickering light of their small fire. The giant's single eye surveyed the trapped men, glowing with a cold, malevolent intelligence. The silence in the cave was thick and heavy, filled with the smell of damp earth and the palpable terror of the cornered Greeks. Their journey into the unknown had just turned into a descent into a living nightmare. The flickering firelight cast monstrous shadows on the cave walls as the Cyclops, Polyphemus, finally spoke, his voice a low rumble like shifting rock. He asked who they were and where they were from, his single eye glinting with a cruel curiosity rather than any sense of welcome. Odysseus, summoning all his courage and wit, stepped forward. He announced they were Greeks returning from Troy, and that they were shipwrecked sailors who threw themselves upon his mercy, appealing to the sacred laws of hospitality protected by Zeus himself. The Cyclops let out a booming, contemptuous laugh. He cared nothing for Zeus or the other gods. He roared. The Cyclops were stronger than the gods. He had no intention of offering them hospitality. Instead, without another word, his hand shot out and snatched 2 of Odysseus's men. Their screams were cut short as the giant smashed their heads against the stone floor, their bodies breaking with a sickening crack. He then proceeded to tear them limb from limb and devour them, crunching on their bones like a wild animal. The remaining Greeks could only watch in frozen, silent horror. It was a savagery beyond anything they had witnessed even in the decade of war. When the giant had finished his gruesome meal, he washed it down with a great draught of milk, stretched out on the cave floor, and fell into a deep sleep, his snores echoing like thunder. Odysseus, in a blind rage, drew his sword, intending to kill the monster in his sleep. But a moment of cold, clear reason stopped him. If he killed the Cyclops, they would all be doomed. They would never be able to move the massive boulder that sealed the cave. They would be trapped, destined to die in this lightless tomb. He had to think. He had to be clever. The next day, the horrific ritual was repeated. The Cyclops awoke, milked his ewes, and then seized and devoured 2 more men for his breakfast. He then rolled away the stone, led his flock out to pasture, and sealed the cave again, leaving Odysseus and his remaining crew in despair. But in that despair, a plan began to form. Odysseus found the Cyclops' club, a massive timber of green olive wood as large as the mast of a ship. He and his men cut off a length of it and sharpened it to a fine point, hardening the tip in the fire. They then hid the stake under a pile of dung. That evening, when Polyphemus returned and ate 2 more men for his supper, Odysseus approached him. He offered the giant the strong, unmixed wine he had brought with him. The Cyclops, who had never tasted wine before, drank it greedily, demanding more. 3 times he drained the bowl, the potent liquor quickly clouding his mind. In his drunken state, he asked for Odysseus's name, promising him a gift. Odysseus, with a cunning smile, told him, "My name is Nobody." The giant laughed and told Nobody that his gift would be that he would be eaten last. With that, he collapsed into a drunken stupor. This was their chance. Odysseus and his men took the great stake, heated its tip in the fire until it glowed red hot, and with a great, coordinated heave, they drove it deep into the Cyclops' single eye. The giant awoke with a deafening roar of agony, tearing the stake from his sizzling eye socket. He thrashed blindly around the cave, while Odysseus and his men scrambled into the darkest corners. His bellows of pain were so loud that other Cyclopes on the island heard him and came to the outside of his cave, asking what was wrong. "Nobody is killing me," Polyphemus screamed. The other Cyclopes, thinking he was either mad or afflicted by a plague from the gods, simply told him to pray and went away. The first part of the plan had worked, but they were still trapped. At dawn, the blinded, whimpering giant rolled away the stone to let his flock out. He sat at the entrance, his hands outstretched, feeling the backs of each sheep as it passed to make sure none of the men were trying to escape. But Odysseus had another trick. He tied his men to the undersides of the giant rams, 3 sheep to each man. He himself clung to the thick, shaggy fleece of the largest ram. As the great ram passed, Polyphemus stroked its back, wondering aloud why his favorite animal, usually the first to leave, was last today. He spoke to it tenderly, imagining it was grieving for its master's lost eye. Unaware, he let the ram and Odysseus pass through to freedom. Once clear of the cave, Odysseus untied his men, and they scrambled to their ship. But as they sailed away, Odysseus's pride got the better of him. He couldn't resist shouting back at the shore, taunting the blinded giant. Polyphemus, hearing his voice, tore off the top of a mountain and hurled it at the ship, nearly sinking them. His men begged him to be silent, but Odysseus's ego demanded the last word. He shouted again, this time revealing his true name. "If anyone asks who blinded you," he roared, "tell them it was Odysseus, son of Laertes, from Ithaca." It was a fatal mistake. Polyphemus, now knowing his tormentor's name, raised his hands to the sky and prayed to his father, Poseidon. He asked that Odysseus never reach home, or, if he must, that he return late, alone, in a stranger's ship, to find a world of pain. The god of the sea heard his son's prayer. Let's talk about Poseidon, god of the sea, earthquakes, horses, and holding a grudge with the tenacity of a barnacle on a ship's hull. If the Olympian pantheon was a corporate office, Zeus was the flashy, unpredictable CEO, and Poseidon was the head of the notoriously volatile shipping and logistics department. He was one of the big 3, along with his brothers Zeus and Hades, who drew lots to divide up the cosmos after they overthrew the Titans. Poseidon got the sea, which was a pretty sweet deal, covering about 3/4 of the planet. He wasn't just in charge of the water, he was the water. His mood dictated the tides. A good day for Poseidon meant calm seas and gentle breezes. A bad day meant tsunamis, hurricanes, and your entire coastal city being abruptly relocated underwater. He was, in essence, the ultimate micromanager of maritime affairs. His primary symbol was the trident, a 3-pronged spear that was less of a weapon and more of a divine remote control for geologic chaos. With a jab of his trident, he could shatter mountains, create islands, and stir up storms that made even the most seasoned sailors suddenly remember every prayer they'd ever learned. He was powerful, respected, and deeply, deeply sensitive. You did not want to get on Poseidon's bad side. Just ask Odysseus. The entire second half of Odysseus's 10-year journey home was basically one long, drawn-out consequence of him angering the sea god. By blinding Polyphemus, Odysseus didn't just injure a giant, he attacked Poseidon's son. This turned Odysseus's voyage from a simple trip home into a divinely ordained nightmare. Poseidon's vengeance wasn't subtle. He literally stalked Odysseus across the sea, throwing storms, shipwrecks, and general maritime misery at him whenever he got close to home. It was the divine equivalent of a celestial restraining order enforced by hurricanes. But Poseidon's drama wasn't just with mortals. he had a long-standing rivalry with his niece, Athena. Their most famous spat was over the city of Athens. In a divine contest, Poseidon struck the Acropolis with his trident and produced a saltwater spring, a bold, dramatic, but ultimately pretty useless gesture. Athena, in a much more practical move, created the olive tree. The Athenians, being a pragmatic people, chose the gift that gave them food, oil, and wood over the one that just made the ground salty. Poseidon did not take the loss well. He ruled from his underwater palace, surrounded by sea nymphs and mythical creatures, a brooding, powerful, and easily offended king whose temper could literally reshape the world. Moral of the story: always pack a life raft. Never poke a giant in its single solitary eye. And sometimes, the best way to ensure a safe voyage is to make sure the god of the sea doesn't know your name. Having narrowly escaped the clutches of the blinded Cyclops, Odysseus and his crew sailed on, their spirits a strange mix of exhilaration and terror. They soon arrived at the island of Aeolia, a floating bronze island that was home to Aeolus, the keeper of the winds. Aeolus was a mortal man, but he had been made a friend of the gods and given dominion over the storms and breezes of the world. He lived in a grand palace with his 6 sons and 6 daughters, who were married to each other, in a state of perpetual feasting and happiness. Aeolus welcomed Odysseus and his men with great warmth and hospitality. For a full month, they stayed on his island, and Odysseus recounted the long and brutal story of the Trojan War and his disastrous journey so far. The Windkeeper was captivated by his tales, and when the time came for Odysseus to leave, he decided to give him a magnificent gift to ensure his safe and speedy return to Ithaca. He gathered all the stormy, contrary winds and bound them tightly in a bag made of oxhide, securing it with a silver cord so that not even the smallest puff could escape. He left only the gentle west wind free to blow Odysseus's ships straight home. This was an act of incredible generosity, a divine shortcut that would erase the long and dangerous miles that lay between them and Ithaca. With this gift, the journey would take mere days, not years. Odysseus placed the bag securely in the hold of his ship and warned his crew not to touch it under any circumstances. For 9 days and 9 nights, they sailed with the steady west wind at their backs, moving swiftly across the sea. Odysseus himself manned the helm for the entire time, never sleeping, so eager was he to see his homeland. On the 10th day, his exhaustion finally overtook him. In the distance, they could see the shores of Ithaca, so close they could make out the flickering of campfires. Home was within their grasp. With the end in sight, Odysseus finally allowed himself to rest and fell into a deep sleep. As soon as he was asleep, his crew, who had been watching the oxhide bag with suspicion and greed, began to mutter amongst themselves. They were convinced that Aeolus had given Odysseus a great treasure of gold and silver, which their captain was keeping for himself. They felt it was unfair that he should have all the glory and all the wealth. Their resentment, fueled by exhaustion and a profound lack of trust, boiled over. They decided they deserved a share of the treasure. Ignoring Odysseus's explicit warnings, they untied the silver cord and opened the bag. In an instant, all the wild, chaotic winds that Aeolus had so carefully imprisoned burst forth in a single, furious tempest. A hurricane of unimaginable force erupted, seizing the ships and spinning them around. The gentle west wind was overwhelmed. the ships were blown violently backwards, away from the shores of Ithaca, which vanished from sight as they were hurled back across the sea. Odysseus awoke to the chaos, to the screaming of the winds and the despairing cries of his men. He saw the empty bag, and he understood the folly of his crew. His heart sank with a despair so deep he considered throwing himself into the sea. But he endured. They were blown all the way back to Aeolia, back to the floating bronze island. Disheveled and ashamed, Odysseus went to the palace of Iolus and explained what had happened. But the Windkeeper's hospitality had vanished. He looked at Odysseus with horror and disgust. He believed that for such a disaster to have occurred, Odysseus must be a man cursed by the gods, hated by the heavens. He refused to help him a second time. He cast him out of his palace and off his island, telling him to be gone from this place, for he would not help a man so obviously despised by the immortals. Defeated and with no winds to help them, Odysseus and his men had to row, their hearts as heavy as their oars, away from the island and back into the vast, unforgiving sea. Dejected and exhausted, rowing with the strength of despair rather than hope, Odysseus and his crew sailed on for 6 days and nights. The foolishness of the crew had cost them their swift journey home, and now every mile was earned through back-breaking labor. On the 7th day, they sighted a distant land, a citadel perched atop sheer cliffs with a narrow, protected harbor. This was Telepylus, the land of the Laestrygonians. The entrance to the harbor was flanked by 2 steep headlands, leaving only a small channel to enter. The water inside was unnaturally calm, a placid, landlocked pool. All of the ships in the fleet, save one, sailed confidently into this sheltered cove, eager to find rest and fresh water. The other captains moored their ships close together, deep within the harbor. But Odysseus, guided by a flicker of his old caution, felt a deep sense of unease. He decided to moor his own ship outside the harbor entrance, tying it to a rock on the open coast. It was a decision that would save his life. As with the land of the Cyclops, he sent 3 men ashore to scout. The scouts followed a path inland and came across a young woman of immense size, a giantess, who was drawing water from a spring. She was the daughter of the Laestrygonian king, Antiphates. When they asked her who ruled this land, she pointed them towards her father's palace. They made their way to the palace, but what they found inside was a scene of pure horror. The queen was a mountain of a woman, as tall as a peak, and she regarded them with a predatory hunger. She immediately called for her husband, the king. Antiphates appeared, and, without a word of welcome or a single question, he snatched up one of the 3 scouts and began to devour him on the spot. The other 2 men fled in terror, running for their lives back towards the harbor. The alarm was raised. The Laestrygonians were not just giants. They were a race of cannibalistic giants. They poured out of their city, thousands of them, not like men, but like monsters, and swarmed the cliffs surrounding the harbor. They began to hurl massive boulders down upon the trapped fleet. The sound was deafening. The splintering of wood, the crunch of rock against hull, and the screams of dying men. The ships were smashed to kindling. The giants then waded into the calm waters of the harbor, spearing the drowning sailors like fish and carrying them off to be eaten. It was a massacre. From his vantage point outside the harbor, Odysseus watched in helpless horror as his fleet, his men, his comrades from the long years at Troy, were utterly destroyed. There was nothing he could do to save them. He saw the water of the harbor churned red with blood. Realizing the immediate danger to his own ship, he drew his sword and cut the mooring ropes. He screamed at his remaining crew to row for their lives, to put all their strength into their oars. His men responded with the frantic energy of sheer terror. His ship shot away from that cursed coast, away from the slaughterhouse of a harbor. Of the 12 ships that had left Troy, only one remained. Of the hundreds of men who had sailed with him, only the small crew of his own vessel had survived. The rest were gone, their journey ending not in glory, but as a feast for giants. A heavy, soul-crushing silence fell over the lone surviving ship as it made its way back out to the open sea. The cost of this journey was becoming unbearable. Let's talk about Circe. The goddess sorceress, the original hostess with the absolute mostest, provided your definition of mostest includes turning your entire friend group into livestock. If you've ever felt simultaneously like a powerful, independent enchantress, a slightly lonely island dweller, and a firm believer that men are, quite literally, pigs, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with ancient Greece's most glamorous and problematic witch. Circe lived on the island of Aiaia in a beautiful palace nestled in a forest clearing. She wasn't your typical spooky, haggard witch. She was a goddess, daughter of the sun god Helios, and she had the eternal beauty and divine power to match. She spent her days weaving on a magical loom and singing with a voice so enchanting it could lure any mortal to their doom. She was, in essence, the ultimate lifestyle influencer of the ancient world. If her brand was a mix of high-end home decor, artisanal weaving, and light cannibalism. Her island was weirdly peaceful. The woods were filled with lions and wolves, but they didn't attack. They just fawned on visitors like well-trained puppies, their eyes filled with a strange, human sadness. This wasn't a good sign. It was the divine equivalent of a 5-star review that ends with, "But the other guests seemed a little off." When Odysseus's men arrived, she greeted them with the utmost civility. She invited them into her palace, sat them on silver-studded chairs, and served them a delicious meal of cheese, barley, and honey, mixed with a fine Pramnian wine. Classic hospitality. Except, she also mixed in one of her special potions. After they'd eaten, she tapped each of them with her wand, and poof, they were transformed into pigs. They still had their human minds, so they were fully aware that they were now grunting, snuffling swine, trapped in a sty. Circe wasn't necessarily evil. From her perspective, this was just a very effective way of managing unwanted male attention. It was her island, her rules, and her rules involved a strict no-nonsense policy on visitors, enforced by magical transmogrification. It was a bit extreme, sure, but it probably cut down on a lot of tedious small talk. Then came Odysseus, armed with a tip from the god Hermes and a magical herb called moly. He was immune to her magic. He drank her potion, and when she tried to tap him with her wand, nothing happened. He drew his sword, and she, for the first time, was terrified. This confrontation, however, didn't end in a battle. It ended with a negotiation, which quickly led to Odysseus becoming her lover and living with her in luxury for a full year. Because nothing says timeless myth like your captor becoming your extremely well-appointed bed and breakfast host. Moral of the story: never accept a drink from a stranger, especially if she's a goddess known for her animal husbandry skills. Always carry a magical herb. And sometimes, the best way to deal with a powerful sorceress is to just move in with her for a while. The lone black ship, a ghost of a once proud fleet, sailed on, its crew numb with grief and exhaustion. The slaughter by the Laestrygonians had hollowed them out, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than any storm. At last, they came to another island, Aea, the home of the sorceress Circe. They beached their ship in a quiet harbor, and for 2 days and 2 nights, they did nothing but lie on the sand, consumed by their sorrow. On the 3rd day, Odysseus, knowing he could not let his men succumb to despair, took his spear and sword and climbed a high lookout point. From there, he saw smoke rising from a clearing deep within the island's dense forest, a sign of life. But after their recent encounters, a sign of life was as much a threat as it was a promise. He returned to his men and tried to raise their spirits, telling them that while they were still alive, there was still hope. He divided his remaining crew into 2 parties. He would command one, and a man named Eurylochus would command the other. They drew lots to see who would go and explore the source of the smoke. The lot fell to Eurylochus. With a heavy heart and a deep sense of foreboding, Eurylochus led his party of 22 men into the woods. They walked through the eerie, silent forest and soon came to a clearing. In the center stood a palace made of smooth stone. The woods around the palace were filled with lions and wolves, but strangely, the beasts did not attack. They padded up to the men, whining and wagging their tails like dogs greeting their master. The men were terrified, but the animals were strangely docile, their eyes holding a disquieting hint of human intelligence. As they neared the palace, they heard a beautiful voice singing. It was Circe, weaving at her great loom. The sound was so enchanting, so pure, that it seemed to banish their fears. One of the men, Polites, the most trusted of Odysseus's officers in that group, suggested they call out to her. He argued that anyone who could sing so beautifully could not mean them harm. They called out, and Circe herself came to the gleaming doors and invited them in. All of them, enchanted by her beauty and her grace, eagerly followed her inside, all except Eurylochus. He alone felt the trap. He suspected some kind of trickery and stayed behind, hiding in the shadows to watch. Circe treated her guests with lavish hospitality. She sat them in fine chairs and served them a rich potion of cheese, barley, honey, and wine. But laced within the sweet drink were her wicked drugs. Once they had drunk it all, she struck each man with her wand. Instantly, they were transformed. Their bodies sprouted bristles, their noses became snouts, and they began to grunt and snuffle. They had become pigs, but their minds remained human, trapped within their new grotesque forms. They wept as Circe drove them into her pigsties and threw them acorns and cornel berries to eat. They were prisoners, utterly helpless. Eurylochus waited, but when his men did not reappear, he feared the worst. He ran back to the ship, distraught and terrified, and told Odysseus the terrible news. He was convinced they had been led into a trap by a witch and were all dead. His story was disjointed, broken by sobs of terror and grief. He begged Odysseus to set sail immediately, to flee this cursed island before they too were lost. Upon hearing Eurylochus's frantic tale of vanishing men and a singing witch, Odysseus was not moved to flee. A cold, determined anger settled over him. His men were in danger, and as their captain, it was his duty to save them, no matter the risk. He told Eurylochus to stay and guard the ship, while he himself would go to the palace. He took his sword and his bow and set off alone into the eerie forest. As he neared Circe's palace, a young man, handsome and carrying a golden wand, appeared before him. It was the god Hermes, the messenger of the gods, sent by Athena to help him. Hermes warned Odysseus of Circe's magic. He explained that she would offer him a poisoned drink, and after he drank it, she would try to turn him into a pig with her wand. The god then gave Odysseus a secret weapon. He pulled a plant from the ground. Its root was black, and its flower was as white as milk. The gods called it moly, and it was a powerful antidote to any sorcery. Hermes instructed Odysseus to drink Circe's potion, for the moly would make him immune. Then, when she tried to strike him with her wand, he was to draw his sword and rush at her as if he were going to kill her. She would be terrified and would invite him to her bed. Hermes advised him not to refuse, but to first make her swear a solemn oath by the gods that she would not try any more tricks or harm him in any way. With these instructions, Hermes vanished. Odysseus proceeded to the palace. Circe greeted him just as she had his men, inviting him in and offering him her drugged wine in a golden cup. Odysseus drank it, the moly protecting him. Circe watched him, a slight, cruel smile on her lips. When he had drained the cup, she struck him with her wand and said, "Go now to the sty and lie down with your friends." But nothing happened. Odysseus stood unchanged. As Hermes had instructed, he drew his great bronze sword and lunged at her, his face a mask of cold fury. Circe shrieked in terror and fell to her knees, clutching his legs. No mortal had ever resisted her magic before. She knew at once that he must be the man a prophecy had foretold would one day come to her island, the clever and resourceful Odysseus. Her fear turned to awe, and then to something else. She invited him to her bed so they could learn to trust each other. Odysseus, remembering Hermes' warning, agreed, but only after she swore the unbreakable oath of the gods not to harm him. That night, Odysseus became Circe's lover, but even in her luxurious palace, he could not eat or drink. His mind was still on his trapped men. Circe, seeing his sorrow, understood. She took her wand, went to the pigsty, and anointed each pig with another potion. Their bristles fell away, and they transformed back into men, though they were younger and more handsome than before. They wept with joy as they recognized Odysseus, and their reunion was so emotional that even Circe was moved. She then invited the rest of the crew from the ship to her palace. Eurylochus at first resisted, still terrified, but the will of the other men persuaded him. And so, Odysseus and his entire crew stayed on Aiaia, living in Circe's palace, feasting every day and recovering their strength. What was meant to be a short rest turned into a full year. They lived in such comfort and luxury that they almost forgot about Ithaca, lost in the timeless enchantment of the sorceress's island. Let's talk about the underworld, also known as Hades. Basically, if you've ever felt simultaneously like you're in a dark, joyless, and inescapable place filled with whispering ghosts, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with ancient Greece's premier destination for the deceased. Hades wasn't hell, not in the fire and brimstone sense. It was just the end a vast, shadowy, subterranean realm where the souls of the dead, known as shades, wandered for eternity. It was less about punishment and more about a profound, eternal sense of bummer. The whole place was, in essence, a divine waiting room with no magazines and no exit. The god Hades, brother of Zeus and Poseidon, was its ruler. He wasn't evil, just stern, gloomy, and very, very serious about his job. He was the ultimate celestial bureaucrat, in charge of making sure the dead stayed dead and didn't wander back upstairs to bother the living. His biggest PR problem was that his name became synonymous with his realm, so everyone assumed he was the bad guy. Really, he was just the universe's most efficient and humorless funeral director. To get there, you couldn't just buy a ticket. The journey was a whole ordeal. You had to cross the river Styx, a feat which required payment to Charon, the spectral ferryman. If your family didn't put a coin in your mouth when you died, you were stuck on the wrong side of the river for 100 years, which is the ancient world equivalent of having your credit card declined at the ultimate toll booth. Once across, you had to face Cerberus, the three-headed guard dog of the underworld. He was great at letting souls in, but absolutely terrible at letting them out. Think of him as divine security with a very strict no re-entry policy. The underworld itself was divided into several regions. There was the Asphodel Meadows, the default destination for most average souls. Here, the shades just drifted aimlessly, whispering and squeaking, with no memory of their former lives. It was eternal, mindless boredom. Then there was Tartarus, the deep abyss used as a dungeon of torment and suffering for the wicked, and for anyone who seriously ticked off the gods, like the Titans. This was the bad neighborhood, the maximum security prison of the afterlife. And, for the very, very few, the heroes and the exceptionally virtuous, there was Elysium, or the Elysian Fields. This was the good part, a paradise of eternal spring where the blessed could enjoy a peaceful and happy afterlife. Getting there was basically the divine equivalent of winning the lottery. For Odysseus, his trip was a business trip. Circe sent him there not because he was dead, but because he needed to consult the ghost of the blind prophet Tiresias, who was the only one who could give him a reliable map home. So he had to perform a complex ritual involving a pit, animal blood, and prayers to summon the dead. The blood would temporarily give the shades the ability to speak and think clearly. Imagine having to conduct a work meeting where your colleagues are all ghosts, and you have to keep them coherent with a bucket of sheep's blood. It was a terrifying, necessary detour on his already absurdly long journey home. Moral of the story: always carry loose change for the ferryman. Don't pet the three-headed dog. And sometimes, the only way to get good directions is to go to the land of the dead and ask a ghost. The year on Circe's island passed in a haze of feasting and pleasure. But as the seasons turned, the men's thoughts turned once more to home. They approached Odysseus and reminded him of Ithaca, of the wives and children they had left behind. The spell of the island was broken. Odysseus knew they were right. That night, he went to Circe and told her it was time for them to leave, asking her to fulfill her promise to help him on his way. Circe agreed, but the path she laid out was not the one he expected. She told him he could not sail directly for Ithaca. First, he had to make a different, more terrifying journey. He had to sail to the land of the Cimmerians, a place shrouded in perpetual mist and darkness at the edge of the world. There, he would find the entrance to the house of Hades, the land of the dead. He had to descend into the underworld. The purpose of this journey was to consult the spirit of Tiresias, the blind prophet of Thebes. Tiresias, even in death, retained his prophetic powers, a special gift from the goddess Persephone. Only he could tell Odysseus what trials still lay ahead and how he could finally reach home. The news filled Odysseus and his men with dread. The very idea of visiting the realm of the dead was horrifying. They wept and tore at their hair, but the decision was made. Circe gave Odysseus detailed instructions for the ritual he must perform. He was to dig a trench and pour libations into it: milk, honey, wine, and water. Then he was to sacrifice a ram and a black ewe, letting their blood flow into the trench. The scent of the blood would draw the spirits of the dead towards him. He had to use his sword to keep the swarming, insubstantial ghosts at bay until Tiresias appeared. He must let the prophet drink the blood first, for only then would he regain the ability to speak the truth. Following her instructions, they sailed from Aiaia. The journey was eerie and swift, guided by a magical wind sent by Circe. They reached the shores of the land of the Cimmerians, a place where the sun never shone. It was a bleak, ghostly landscape, a fitting entrance to the realm of the dead. Odysseus left his ship and found the spot Circe had described, where the river of fire and the river of tears converge. There, he dug the pit with his sword and performed the solemn rites. As the dark blood of the sacrificed sheep pooled in the trench, the shades of the dead began to rise from the earth. They were like a swarm of bats, whispering and flitting around the pit, their eyes filled with a desperate longing for the blood, for a momentary taste of life. The first spirit to approach was that of Elpenor, one of his own crewmen who had died on Circe's island, having fallen from her roof in a drunken stupor. No one had noticed he was missing, and he had been left unburied. He begged Odysseus to return to Aiaia and give him proper funeral rites so his spirit could find peace. Odysseus promised he would. Then, a far more poignant spirit appeared. It was his mother, Anticleia, whom he had left alive and well in Ithaca. Seeing her among the dead was a profound shock. He wept, but even for her, he had to hold his ground, keeping her away from the blood until the prophet arrived. He stood with his sword drawn, a lone living man surrounded by a tide of the whispering dead, waiting in the crushing darkness for the one ghost who held the key to his future. As Odysseus stood guard over the pit of blood, fending off the thirsty, insubstantial shades, the spirit of the great prophet Tiresias finally emerged from the gloom. He was a majestic figure, even in death, holding a golden scepter. Odysseus allowed him to approach and drink the dark blood. At once, the prophet's voice gained substance, and he spoke. He foretold the rest of Odysseus's journey, a prophecy filled with both hope and dire warnings. He confirmed that the god Poseidon was still enraged over the blinding of his son, and would make the voyage home treacherous. He then gave Odysseus a critical warning. When they landed on the island of Thrinacia, they would find the sacred cattle and sheep of the sun, God, Helios. No matter how hungry or desperate they were, they must not harm these animals. If they left the cattle untouched, they might still reach Ithaca, though not without suffering. But if they harmed the sacred herds, Tiresias prophesied the utter destruction of his ship and his entire crew. He alone might escape, but he would return home late, a broken man on a foreign ship, to find his house filled with arrogant suitors devouring his wealth and trying to marry his wife. He also foretold the bloody revenge Odysseus would take on these suitors. After giving his prophecy, Tiresias retreated back into the darkness. Now, Odysseus could finally speak to the other spirits. He allowed his mother, Anticleia, to drink the blood. Her memory returned, and she recognized him. Their reunion was heartbreaking. She told him of the situation back in Ithaca. His wife, Penelope, was still faithful, weeping and waiting for him. His son, Telemachus, was now a man, trying to protect their estate, and his father, Laertes, had retreated to his farm in grief. She herself, she explained, had died of a broken heart, from the sheer loneliness and longing for his return. Odysseus tried 3 times to embrace her, but his arms passed right through her, like smoke or a shadow. It was a painful reminder that they were separated by the unbridgeable gulf between life and death. After his mother faded away, a procession of other famous spirits appeared, sent by Queen Persephone. He spoke with the ghosts of queens and heroines of old. Then came the shades of his fallen comrades from Troy. Agamemnon, the great king who had led the Greek army, told him the story of his own tragic homecoming. He had been murdered by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover upon his return. He warned Odysseus to be cautious, to trust no woman, and to return to Ithaca in secret, not openly. Then came the spirit of Achilles, the greatest warrior of them all. Odysseus praised him, saying that he must be a great king even among the dead. But Achilles' reply was filled with a profound bitterness. He said he would rather be a poor, landless farmer, a slave to another man on earth, than be the king of all the dead. In the underworld, there was no glory, no joy, only a gray, empty existence. This conversation revealed the deep Greek love of life, no matter how hard, over the honor of a glorious death. Odysseus also saw Ajax, who still held a grudge over their dispute for the arms of Achilles and refused to speak to him. He saw mythological figures suffering eternal punishments, like Tantalus and Sisyphus. It was a journey through his own past and the collective memory of his people, a grim and sobering experience that would forever change him. Let's talk about the Sirens, the original one-hit wonder girl group with a killer hook and a notoriously dangerous fan base. If you've ever felt that your music was so captivating, it could literally cause people to lose all sense of self-preservation and sail their boats directly into a pile of rocks. Congratulations. You've spiritually connected with ancient Greece's most lethal vocal trio. The Sirens lived on the island of Anthemoessa, which, from a distance, probably looked like a lovely, peaceful meadow. But as you got closer, you'd notice the whole island was littered with the bones of dead sailors, their bodies rotting in piles around the flowery fields. It was the ancient world's most brutal music festival, where the price of admission was your life. They weren't just pretty singers. They were mythological creatures, often depicted as part woman, part bird. Their primary skill was their voice. They sang a song so beautiful, so enchanting, that no mortal could resist its call. It wasn't just a catchy tune. It was a psychic assault. The song promised to reveal all the secrets of the universe, to tell the listener everything that had ever happened and everything that ever would. It preyed on the listener's deepest desires for knowledge, glory, and meaning. It was, in essence, the ultimate clickbait, a promise so irresistible that you would sail your ship into jagged rocks just to hear the end of the verse. They were a test, a divine filter for sailors. Anyone driven by pure impulse, anyone who couldn't control their desires, would fall victim. They represented the fatal allure of knowledge without wisdom, the danger of a promise that sounds too good to be true. Imagine a band so good that the government has to issue travel warnings about them. That was the Sirens. Their whole business model was based on luring people to their doom with a melody. No marketing department, no merchandise, just one perfect, lethal song. For Odysseus, facing them was a unique challenge. Circe had given him very specific instructions. His crew was to plug their ears with beeswax so they couldn't hear the song at all. They had to be deaf to the temptation. But Odysseus, with his insatiable curiosity and his hero's ego, wanted to hear the song. He wanted to be the only man to hear it and live to tell the tale. So, he had his men tie him to the mast of the ship. They were ordered to bind him as tightly as possible and to ignore any pleas, commands, or threats he might make once he fell under the song's spell. If he begged to be released, they were to tie him even tighter. It was a plan that relied entirely on the discipline of his crew and the strength of his ropes. It was the ultimate act of controlled self-destruction, a way to experience a fatal temptation without paying the ultimate price. Moral of the story: always bring earplugs on a boat trip. Never underestimate the power of a good song. And sometimes, the only way to survive a deadly temptation is to have your friends tie you up until it passes. Having left the shadowy realm of the dead, Odysseus and his ship returned to Aiaia to fulfill his promise to Elpenor. They gave their fallen comrade a proper funeral, burning his body and his armor, and building a burial mound topped with the ore he had used in life. Circe welcomed them back and provided them with food and wine for their onward journey. She also took Odysseus aside and gave him one final set of warnings about the dangers that lay ahead. She told him of the Sirens, of Scylla and Charybdis, and of the sacred cattle of the sun god. The next morning, they set sail once more. As they approached the island of the Sirens, Odysseus followed Circe's instructions precisely. He took a large cake of beeswax, kneaded it until it was soft, and then plugged the ears of every man in his crew. They would be deaf to the Sirens' enchanting song. For himself, he had a different plan. His thirst for knowledge and experience was too great to simply block out the legendary song. He had his men take him to the mast of the ship and bind him to it with heavy ropes, his hands and feet tied securely. He gave them a strict, final order. No matter what he said or did, no matter how much he begged or threatened, they were not to release him. If he struggled, they were to add more ropes and pull them tighter. The ship sailed on in an eerie silence, the crew rowing steadily, unable to hear anything but the rhythmic splash of their oars. As they drew level with the Sirens' meadow, the wind died down, and the sea became unnaturally calm. And then, the song began. It floated across the water, a melody of such piercing, unearthly beauty that it seemed to bypass the ears and enter directly into the soul. The voices of the Sirens called out to Odysseus by name, their song weaving a tapestry of praise and promise. They sang of his glory at Troy, of all his great deeds and sufferings. Then they promised more. They promised him knowledge, the wisdom of the gods. They sang that they knew everything that had ever happened on the fertile earth, and everything that was yet to come. It was a temptation tailored perfectly to him, a lure for his heroic pride and his insatiable mind. The song filled him with a frantic, desperate longing. He forgot about Ithaca, his wife, his mission. All he wanted was to go to them, to hear the rest of their song. He thrashed against his bonds, his eyes wide with madness, screaming at his men to release him. He gestured frantically with his eyebrows, commanding them to turn the ship towards the shore. His crew, their ears safely plugged, saw his madness but heard nothing. They only remembered his orders. Two of his most loyal men, Paramedes and Eurylochus, got up and, as instructed, added more ropes, pulling them so tight they cut into his flesh. They simply bent to their oars and rowed harder, pulling the ship through the enchanted waters. They rowed until the island was far behind them, and the beautiful, terrible song had faded into nothing. Only then did they stop. They removed the wax from their ears and untied their captain. Odysseus collapsed on the deck, trembling and exhausted, the siren's melody still echoing in his mind. He was the only man to have ever heard their song and survived, but the experience had left a deep and haunting mark on his soul. Let's talk about Scylla and Charybdis. The original stuck between a rock and a hard place, except the rock is a six-headed monster, and the hard place is a ship-devouring whirlpool. If you've ever had to make a decision between two equally terrible, career-ending, life-altering options, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with ancient Greece's most stressful geographical feature. Scylla and Charybdis were two monsters who lived on opposite sides of a very narrow strait of water. You couldn't sail through the middle. You had to choose a side. It was the ultimate no-win scenario. A divine Kobayashi Maru designed to test a captain's ability to make an impossible choice. On one side, you had Charybdis. She wasn't so much a monster as a sentient natural disaster. 3 times a day, she would suck down a massive amount of seawater, creating a gigantic, inescapable whirlpool that would obliterate any ship that came near it. Then, 3 times a day, she'd vomit it all back up. It was a spectacular and spectacularly lethal display of hydrodynamics. Choosing to sail near Charybdis was an all-or-nothing gamble. If you timed it wrong, your entire ship, every man, every plank of wood, would be gone forever. On the other side, you had Scylla. She lived in a cave high up on a cliff face. She was a grotesque creature with 12 feet and 6 long serpentine necks, each topped with a hideous head full of 3 rows of razor-sharp teeth. As ships passed below, she would snake her heads down and pluck sailors right off the deck, 1 for each head. Choosing to sail near Scylla was not a gamble. It was a certainty. You knew you were going to lose 6 men. It was a guaranteed, quantifiable loss. Circe, in her final travel advisory to Odysseus, was very clear about this. She advised him to choose Scylla. Her reasoning was cold, brutal, and pragmatic. It is better to lose 6 men and have the rest of the crew and the ship survive than to risk losing everything to Charybdis. It was the ancient world's version of a cost-benefit analysis, where the cost was measured in human lives. This choice wasn't about heroism or fighting. Circe specifically warned Odysseus not to try and fight Scylla. She was an immortal monster, a thing of death. Trying to fight her would only slow the ship down, giving her time to strike again and take another 6 men. The challenge here was not one of strength, but of leadership and psychological fortitude. Odysseus had to knowingly and deliberately sacrifice 6 of his own men. He had to steer his ship towards a monster, listen to the screams of the men being taken, and keep rowing. It was a test of his ability to make a terrible, necessary decision for the greater good of the mission. It represented the brutal calculus of leadership, where sometimes the best option is still a horrifying one. Moral of the story: sometimes there are no good choices. Always listen to the witch who gives you travel advice. And when faced with an impossible decision, pick the one that lets you live to regret it later. Having survived the lure of the sirens, the crew of the lone ship faced their next and most dreaded challenge: the narrow strait guarded by Scylla and Charybdis. Odysseus, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what was to come, did not tell his men the full truth. He warned them about the terrifying whirlpool of Charybdis, knowing that the sight of it would be enough to make them panic and stop rowing. He did not, however, mention Scylla. He feared that if they knew about the 6-headed monster, they would be paralyzed by terror and refuse to sail any further, dooming them all. He ordered them to row with all their might through the strait, hugging the cliff face on one side. As they entered the narrow passage, the sound was the first thing that hit them: a deep, thunderous roar as Charybdis began to suck down the sea. The water seethed and boiled like a cauldron over a great fire. The whirlpool formed, a vortex of unimaginable power, sucking the dark sand from the bottom of the ocean to the surface. The sight was one of pure, elemental chaos. The men screamed in terror, dropping their oars, convinced they were about to die. It was in this moment of distraction, as every eye was fixed on the horror of Charybdis, that Scylla struck. Odysseus, despite Circe's warning, had put on his armor and stood at the prow with 2 spears, his eyes scanning the cliffs. But he saw nothing. The monster was hidden in the gloom of her misty cave. Her attack was silent and swift. 6 long, ghastly necks snaked down from the cliff face, and her monstrous heads, filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth, snatched 6 of his best men from the deck. One moment they were there, and the next they were gone, lifted high into the air. Odysseus heard their screams. They cried out his name one last time as Scylla dragged them up the rock face to the entrance of her cave. He saw them, dangling and writhing, their arms and legs flailing in the air as the monster devoured them alive at her doorstep. Their screams echoed off the cliffs, a sound of pure, hopeless agony. It was, Odysseus would later say, the most pitiful and horrifying thing he had ever seen in all his years of suffering. There was nothing he could do. He had to force the rest of the crew to keep rowing, to get the ship clear of the strait before Charybdis began to vomit the sea back up, or before Scylla could strike again. He had to sail on, leaving his 6 men to their gruesome fate. The image of their dying moments was seared into his mind, a fresh layer of trauma on a soul already burdened with so much loss. They had passed the test, but the cost was sickening. They had survived, but they were fewer, and they were broken. The ship emerged from the strait into open water, the crew weeping not just from fear, but from the grief of watching their friends die in the most horrific way imaginable, while they were powerless to help. After the horror of the strait, the ship and its traumatized crew came to Thrinacia, the island of the sun. The island was lush and green, and from the ship they could hear the gentle lowing of cattle and the bleating of sheep. Odysseus remembered the prophecies of both Tiresias and Circe with a chill. They had both warned him, in the strongest possible terms, to avoid this island, or at least to leave the sacred herds of the sun god, Helios, completely untouched. He told his men they must sail past, but his crew, led by the ever-argumentative Eurylochus, was at the point of mutiny. They were utterly exhausted, their bodies and spirits broken by the ordeal with Scylla and Charybdis. They refused to spend another night at sea. They accused Odysseus of being made of iron, of having no pity for their suffering. Eurylochus argued that they should land, just for one night, to cook a proper meal and to sleep on solid ground. He swore a solemn oath that they would not touch the sacred cattle. Reluctantly, Odysseus agreed, but only after making every single man on the crew swear the same powerful oath. He knew the danger of temptation. They landed on the island and made their camp in a sheltered cove. For a time, things were fine. They had plenty of food and wine left from Circe's provisions. But then, a great storm arose. For a full month, a relentless south wind blew, trapping them on the island. They could not leave. Their supplies ran out. Starvation began to set in. They scoured the island for food, catching what fish and birds they could. But it was not enough. They grew gaunt and weak, their bellies gnawed by a desperate hunger. Odysseus watched them, his heart filled with dread. One day, he went inland alone to pray to the gods for some means of escape. As he prayed, a deep sleep fell over him. It was then that Eurylochus made his fatal speech. He gathered the starving men and argued that dying of starvation was the most pitiful way for a man to die. It was better, he said, to risk the wrath of the gods and die quickly than to waste away slowly. He proposed that they take the best of Helios's cattle, sacrifice them to the gods, and eat them. He reasoned that if they ever got back to Ithaca, they could build a magnificent temple to Helios to appease him. His words, preying on their desperate hunger, convinced the crew. They went to the herds, selected the finest of the cattle, and performed a makeshift sacrifice, using water for wine and oak leaves for barley. Then, they roasted the meat and began to feast. It was at that moment that Odysseus awoke and smelled the roasting meat. He knew at once what had happened, and a cry of despair tore from his lips. He knew they were all doomed. The sun god Helios, seeing what had happened from his chariot in the sky, was filled with rage. He went to Olympus and demanded that Zeus and the other gods punish Odysseus's men for their sacrilege. He threatened that if justice was not done, he would go down to the underworld and shine among the dead, leaving the world of the living in darkness. Zeus promised that their crime would be avenged. For 6 days, the men feasted on the cattle. On the 7th day, the storm finally broke and the wind died down. They quickly set sail, believing they had gotten away with it. But as soon as they were out of sight of land, Zeus fulfilled his promise. He gathered a black storm cloud over their ship. A bolt of lightning struck the mast, which crashed down, killing the helmsman. Another bolt struck the ship itself, shattering it to pieces. The men were all thrown into the sea, where they drowned. Their sacrilege had been punished. Only Odysseus survived, clinging to a piece of the broken mast and keel. He was alone, adrift on a vast and empty sea, the last survivor of the great expedition that had left Troy so many years before. Let's talk about Calypso, the beautiful, immortal nymph goddess who lived alone on a paradise island and whose primary character trait was being extremely, divinely clingy. If you've ever felt simultaneously like a goddess of unmatched beauty, the proprietor of a luxurious, all-inclusive, single-occupancy resort, and someone who just cannot take a hint, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the ancient world's most glamorous and possessive recluse. Calypso lived on the island of Ogygia, a place so stunningly beautiful it would make a postcard look drab. It was a natural paradise of lush forests, crystal-clear springs, and fragrant meadows. She spent her days in a magnificent cave, which was less of a cave and more of a divine grotto with excellent acoustics, weaving on her loom with a golden shuttle and singing with a voice that could charm the gods themselves. She was, in essence, running a one-woman utopian society where the only citizen was her. It was perfect, except for one thing. It was incredibly lonely. Enter Odysseus, who washed up on her shore after his entire crew was killed for the whole eating the sacred cattle incident. He was the sole survivor, a broken man clinging to a piece of his wrecked ship. Calypso found him, nursed him back to health, and promptly fell deeply in love with him. She saw this world-weary, traumatized hero and decided he would make the perfect forever companion. She wasn't just offering him a place to stay. She was offering him a permanent position. She promised him immortality. He could live with her forever, never aging, never suffering, in a literal paradise. It was the ancient world's most attractive and most terrifying job offer. For 7 years, she kept him there. It wasn't exactly a prison with bars and chains. It was a prison of perfect comfort, of endless beauty, of a life without struggle. But for Odysseus, it was a prison nonetheless. He spent his days sitting on the shore, looking out at the barren sea, and weeping for his home, for his wife, for his mortal life. He was a hero, a man of action and struggle, and this life of passive, eternal comfort was a kind of death for him. Calypso's love was genuine, but it was also profoundly selfish. She couldn't understand why he would choose a mortal wife and a life of hardship over her and immortality. She saw his tears not as a sign of his deep loyalty and humanity, but as a rejection of her. She was the divine equivalent of someone who can't understand why you'd want to leave the perfect vacation they've planned for you, even if that vacation is scheduled to last for all eternity. Moral of the story: paradise is only paradise if you can leave. Immortality is a tough sell when you're homesick. And sometimes, the most beautiful cage is still a cage. For 9 days, Odysseus drifted on the open sea, clinging to the wreckage of his ship, alone under the vast, uncaring sky. The gods had punished his crew, and now he was left to endure his own solitary fate. On the 10th night, the currents finally carried him to an island. It was Ogygia, the home of the nymph Calypso. This was not a land of monsters or brutal challenges, but of a quiet, seductive beauty. Calypso, the nymph with the lovely braids, found the shipwrecked hero and took him into her magnificent cave. She saved him, but she also claimed him. She fell in love with the clever, long-suffering king of Ithaca and decided he would never leave. For 7 long years, Odysseus was her captive. It was a captivity of comfort and luxury. He lived in her grotto, a place of almost painful beauty, with fires of fragrant cedar and thyme always burning on the hearth. He ate the food of the gods and slept in the bed of a goddess. Calypso offered him the ultimate gift. She would make him immortal and ageless, to live with her forever in this paradise. But Odysseus's heart was not in Ogygia. His spirit was still in Ithaca. Every day, the ritual was the same. He would spend his nights with the nymph, for he had no choice. But by day, he would go to the rocky shore of the island, sit on the beach, and stare out at the endless, empty sea. He would torture himself with thoughts of home, of his wife, Penelope, of his son Telemachus, who was growing into a man without him. Tears would stream down his face as he looked out at the barren sea, a sea that held no promise of a ship, no hope of escape. His heart was consumed with homesickness, a grief so profound that even the beauty of the island and the love of a goddess could not touch it. The life of ease and pleasure that Calypso offered was, to him, a kind of torture. He was a man defined by his struggle, by his journey, by his identity as a husband, father, and king. In Calypso's paradise, he was none of those things. He was simply an object of affection, a pet, a timeless consort with no purpose. The 7 years blurred into one long, monotonous ache. The hero who had sacked Troy and outwitted the Cyclops was now reduced to a weeping, passive prisoner, kept alive by a goddess who loved him too much to let him be himself. Meanwhile, on Olympus, the gods had not forgotten him. His patron, Athena, saw his suffering, and her heart ached for him. She decided that his trials had gone on long enough, while her great rival, Poseidon, was away visiting the Ethiopians. She went before Zeus and the assembled gods and made an impassioned plea for Odysseus. She reminded them of his piety, his wisdom, and his long suffering. She argued that it was unjust for such a man to be held captive, forgotten by the world. Zeus, moved by her words and agreeing that Odysseus's fate had been too harsh, consented. The time had come for the hero's long exile to end. He summoned Hermes, the messenger god, and gave him a command. He was to fly to the island of Ogygia and deliver a message to Calypso. It was the will of the gods that she release Odysseus and help him on his journey home. The gears of fate, which had been stalled for 7 years, began to turn once more. Hermes, the messenger of the gods, strapped on his golden winged sandals and flew like a thought across the sea to Ogygia. He found Calypso in her cave, weaving and singing. She was surprised but gracious, offering him ambrosia and nectar, the food and drink of the gods. But Hermes had come on business. He delivered the decree of Zeus. She must release Odysseus. Calypso was filled with a furious, bitter anger. She railed against the hypocrisy of the male gods, who could take any mortal lover they wished, but became jealous and vindictive when a goddess did the same. She reminded Hermes how she had saved Odysseus, how she had loved him, and offered him immortality. But she knew she could not defy the will of Zeus. Her rage gave way to a sorrowful resignation. She went to find Odysseus, who was in his usual spot on the beach, weeping and looking out at the sea. She told him the news, that he was free to go. She said she would help him build a raft and provision it with food, water, and wine. At first, Odysseus was suspicious. He thought it was another one of her tricks. He made her swear a great oath by the river Styx, the most sacred of vows, that she would not plot any more harm against him. Calypso swore the oath. For 4 days, they worked together. Odysseus, his old skills returning, felled 20 trees with a bronze axe Calypso gave him, and fashioned them into a wide, sturdy raft, complete with a mast and a rudder. On the 5th day, Calypso gave him fresh clothes, filled his provisions, and with a heavy heart set a fair wind at his back to speed him on his way. For 17 days, Odysseus sailed, navigating by the stars as Calypso had instructed him. He was filled with a cautious hope, but he had forgotten about Poseidon. The god of the sea, returning from his trip, saw the raft on the ocean. He was enraged that the other gods had conspired to free Odysseus behind his back. He was determined that the hero's suffering was not yet over. He gathered the clouds and stirred the sea into a terrifying storm. The winds howled, and mountainous waves crashed over the small raft. A wave of incredible size shattered the mast and threw Odysseus into the churning water. He struggled to the surface, gasping for air, and managed to climb back onto the battered raft. But he was at the mercy of the storm. He would surely have died, had it not been for the intervention of a sea nymph, Ino. She took pity on him and gave him her magical veil, which would protect him from harm and allow him to swim to shore. She told him to abandon the raft and swim for the land he could see in the distance. He was hesitant to leave the last remnants of his vessel, but another massive wave smashed the raft to pieces, forcing his hand. He tied the veil around his waist and threw himself into the sea. For 2 days and 2 nights, he was tossed by the waves, swimming through the storm, his body battered and his spirit nearly broken. He was on the verge of giving up when, on the 3rd day, the storm finally subsided, and he saw land was near. But the coast was treacherous, all jagged cliffs and reefs. He was nearly dashed against the rocks before Athena intervened, giving him the presence of mind to cling to a rock until a wave receded. He finally found the mouth of a river where the shore was smooth. Exhausted, he prayed to the river god, who checked his current and allowed him to swim safely to the bank. He collapsed on the shore, half dead, stripped of everything, but alive. He had survived the wrath of the sea god one last time. Let's talk about the Phaeacians, the impossibly charming, super advanced, and tragically naive inhabitants of the island of Scheria. If you've ever felt that your society was the absolute pinnacle of civilization, that your hospitality was second to none, and that you were completely unprepared for the divine drama you were about to invite into your home, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with ancient Greece's most helpful and most doomed culture. The Phaeacians were special. They were related to the gods and lived in a sort of semi-divine bubble. Their king, Alcinous, ruled over a peaceful and prosperous city that was a marvel of technology and artistry. They had self-driving ships that could navigate the seas with no crew and no rudder, responding to thought alone. It was the ancient world's version of a self-driving car, but for the ocean. Their palace was a wonder of bronze walls, silver and gold doors, and enchanted statues of golden youths who held torches to light the halls at night. They were, in essence, living in a mythological Silicon Valley, a utopian society that had perfected art, engineering, and most importantly, leisure. Their entire culture was built around the principle of xenia, or hospitality. They were famously kind to strangers, believing that any visitor could be a god in disguise. They would welcome any wayward traveler, give them the best food and wine, bathe them, clothe them, and then, only after the guest was comfortable, would they ask their name and where they were from. It was the ultimate 5-star hotel experience, and they offered it for free. Their only real job, it seemed, was to provide safe passage home for lost travelers. They were the divine ferry service of the ancient world. Enter Odysseus, washed up on their shore, naked, exhausted, and covered in brine. He was the ultimate test of their hospitality, a man who carried more divine baggage than a pantheon on vacation. The Phaeacians, true to form, welcomed him with open arms. They saw a suffering man and offered him comfort. No questions asked. They didn't realize they were hosting the one man Poseidon hated more than anyone else on the planet. Their kindness and their magical ships were a direct challenge to the sea god's curse. Poseidon had decreed that Odysseus would suffer, and here were the Phaeacians about to use their god-tier technology to give him a comfortable, first-class ride home. This act of supreme kindness was, unfortunately, also an act of supreme defiance against a powerful and vengeful god. There was an old prophecy among the Phaeacians, one they had mostly forgotten. It foretold that one day, Poseidon, angered by their constant helping of travelers, would punish them. He would smash one of their ships as it returned to port and would surround their city with a great mountain, cutting them off from the sea forever. Their greatest virtue, their kindness to strangers, was also their greatest vulnerability. They were a peaceful, happy people on a collision course with a decade-long divine grudge match. Moral of the story: no good deed goes unpunished, especially when it involves the sea god's nemesis. Always screen your guests for divine restraining orders. And sometimes, the most advanced technology in the world can't save you from a very old, very angry god. Battered and near death, Odysseus crawled out of the river onto the shore of the unknown land. He found a thicket of olive trees and burrowed under a pile of leaves, collapsing into a profound, death-like sleep, a healing slumber sent by Athena. While he slept, the goddess was at work. She went to the palace of Alcinous, the king of the Phaeacians, and entered the dreams of his daughter, the beautiful princess Nausicaa. Athena appeared in the guise of one of Nausicaa's friends and gently chided her for neglecting her fine clothes, which were lying in piles, unwashed. She suggested that Nausicaa should go down to the river the next morning with her maids to do the laundry, hinting that it would improve her marriage prospects. Nausicaa awoke at dawn, the dream still vivid in her mind. She went to her parents and, with a charming coyness, asked for a wagon and mules to take the clothes to the washing pools by the river. Her father, amused by her sudden domestic impulse, readily agreed. Soon, Nausicaa and her maids were on their way, the wagon piled high with clothes. They reached the river mouth, a beautiful spot with clear pools perfect for washing. They washed the clothes, spread them on the clean pebbles to dry in the sun, and then bathed themselves. Afterwards, they ate the lunch they had brought and began to play a game of ball, their happy laughter echoing in the quiet air. It was their game that finally woke Odysseus. The ball went astray and landed in the river with a splash, and the girls let out a loud shriek. Odysseus stirred from his leafy shelter. He was a terrifying sight. He was naked, his body caked with dried brine, his hair matted, and his face gaunt from his ordeal. He broke off a leafy branch to cover himself and emerged from the thicket like a wild lion, his eyes glaring. The maids shrieked again, this time in terror, and scattered in every direction. Only Nausicaa stood her ground. Athena had put courage into her heart, and she faced the wild-looking stranger without flinching. Odysseus, seeing her, was immediately struck by her grace and beauty. he wondered if she was a goddess. His mind, ever quick, worked out the best approach. He decided not to clasp her knees, which was the traditional plea of a suppliant, fearing it would be too forward and frighten her. Instead, he stood at a distance and spoke to her with honeyed, eloquent words. He praised her beauty, comparing her to a young palm tree he had once seen on Delos. He told her of his long suffering and how he had been shipwrecked on her shores. He begged her for her help, asking only for some old rags to cover himself and for directions to the city. Nausicaa was impressed by his speech and his noble bearing. She could see that despite his wretched appearance, this was no ordinary man. She called back her maids, scolding them for their fear. She told them that this man was an unfortunate wanderer and that it was their sacred duty to help him, for all strangers and beggars come from Zeus. She ordered them to give him food and drink, and to take him to a sheltered spot by the river to bathe and anoint himself with oil. She gave him fresh clothes from the laundry. After Odysseus had bathed, Athena magically enhanced his appearance, making him seem taller, stronger, and more handsome, with thick, hyacinth-like hair. When he returned, Nausicaa looked at him with admiration. She knew then that he was truly someone special. She gave him instructions on how to get to the city, telling him to follow her wagon, but to wait outside the city gates until she had reached the palace to avoid causing any gossip. She told him to then go to the palace and appeal directly to her mother, Queen Arete. If he could win her sympathy, she said, his safe passage home was assured. Odysseus followed Nausicaa's instructions, waiting outside the city, and then making his way to the palace of Alcinous, shrouded in a magical mist by Athena, so that no one would see him. He entered the magnificent, glowing hall, and, as the mist dissolved, he walked straight to the queen, Arete, and clasped her knees, making his plea as a humble suppliant. King Alcinous and his court were stunned by his sudden appearance. The king, true to the Phaeacian code of hospitality, raised him from the hearth and offered him a seat of honor, food, and wine. He promised that the next day they would arrange for his passage home, wherever that may be. Later that evening, Queen Arete, noticing that the stranger was wearing clothes that she herself had woven, the very clothes Nausicaa had given him, grew suspicious. She questioned him directly, asking who he was and how he had come by those garments. It was then that Odysseus began his story. But he did not yet reveal his name. He first told them of his 7-year captivity on Calypso's island, of his escape on the raft, of Poseidon's storm, and of his desperate swim to their shores, culminating in his meeting with their daughter Nausicaa. The next day, King Alcinous held a great feast in Odysseus's honor. He commanded his finest bard, a blind man named Demodocus, to sing for them. The bard, inspired by the muse, began to sing of the Trojan War. He sang of the famous quarrel between Odysseus and Achilles. As he listened, Odysseus began to weep, pulling his purple cloak over his head to hide his tears. The memories were too fresh, too painful. Only King Alcinous noticed his guest's distress and, with great tact, stopped the song and suggested they all go outside for athletic games. During the games, Odysseus was challenged by one of the young Phaeacian nobles. Goaded, Odysseus picked up a discus far heavier than any the others had been using and threw it with incredible force, far beyond any of their marks. It was a clear demonstration of his heroic strength. Later, back at the feast, Odysseus made a special request of the bard. He asked Demodocus to sing of the Trojan horse, the great wooden horse that Odysseus himself had devised, which had finally brought about the fall of Troy. As the bard sang this tale of his greatest triumph, the floodgates of Odysseus's memory broke completely. He could no longer contain his grief for his lost comrades and the horrors he had witnessed. He sobbed uncontrollably. Again, Alcinous saw his guest's profound sorrow. He stopped the bard once more. He turned to Odysseus and said that the time had come for him to reveal the truth. He must tell them his name, his country, and the full story of his travels and his sufferings. And so, Odysseus began. "I am Odysseus, son of Laertes," he said, and the whole court gasped. His name was legendary. He then recounted the entire epic tale of his 10-year journey. He spoke of the Cicones, the Lotus-Eaters, the Cyclops, Iolus, the Laestrygonians, Circe, his journey to the land of the dead, the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, and the final, fatal mistake with the cattle of the sun god. He told them everything. The Phaeacians listened, spellbound, late into the night. They were a people who lived in peace, far from the troubles of the world. The story he told was a brutal, terrifying, and awe-inspiring epic of a world they could barely imagine. When he finished, they were filled with pity and admiration. They showered him with even more gifts, more treasure than he had won at Troy, and promised that their fastest black ship would take him home the very next day. Let's talk about Ithaca. The small, rocky, goat-herding island kingdom that was, for 10 long years, the most sought-after and unreachable destination in the ancient world. If you've ever felt that your home was simultaneously the most wonderful place in the universe, and also currently occupied by a bunch of entitled, freeloading jerks, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the most famous and troubled island in Greek mythology. Ithaca wasn't a major power, like Mycenae or Sparta. It was described as a rugged island, unfit for driving horses, but a good nurse of young men. It was a tough, practical place that produced tough, practical people, like its king, Odysseus. It was home. It represented not just a physical place, but the entire concept of belonging, of family, of identity. For Odysseus, every monster fought, every storm weathered, was just another obstacle between him and this small pile of rocks in the Ionian Sea. But while Odysseus was away becoming a legend, Ithaca was having some serious problems. With its king presumed dead, the island's political structure had collapsed. A horde of over 100 suitors, young noblemen from Ithaca and the surrounding islands, had descended upon Odysseus's palace. They weren't there to govern or to help. They were there to get their hands on the throne by marrying the queen, Penelope. These suitors were the absolute worst. They were arrogant, greedy, and disrespectful. They moved into Odysseus's house, and for years, they just stayed there, feasting day and night, slaughtering his livestock, drinking his wine, and harassing his servants. They were the divine equivalent of the world's worst house guests, a parasitic infestation that was slowly draining the lifeblood of the entire kingdom. They constantly pressured Penelope to choose one of them, but she remained fiercely loyal to her long-lost husband. She was just as clever as Odysseus, using her wits to hold them at bay. Her most famous trick was the burial shroud for Laertes, Odysseus's father. She promised the suitors she would choose one of them once she finished weaving it. By day, she would work at her loom, but every night she would secretly unravel what she had done. For 3 years, she kept up this deception, a quiet, lonely act of defiance. Meanwhile, Odysseus's son, Telemachus, had grown from a baby into a young man, powerless to stop the suitors and frustrated by his inability to protect his mother and his home. The entire kingdom was in a state of suspended animation, caught between a past that was likely dead and a future that looked bleak and violent. Ithaca was a home in crisis, a symbol of order that had fallen into chaos. When Odysseus finally returned, he wasn't just coming back to his family. He was coming back to reclaim his identity and restore justice to a land that had lost its way. The final act of his epic journey wouldn't be against a monster or a god, but against the decay that had taken root in his own living room. Moral of the story: home is where the heart is, but it's also where people might be eating all your food. Never underestimate the power of a good weaving-based excuse. And sometimes, the biggest monsters you have to fight are the ones sleeping in your guest room. The Phaeacian ship, swift as a thought, cut through the sea, carrying the sleeping Odysseus home. He slept so deeply, it was like death, a final respite after 20 years of struggle. As dawn broke, the ship arrived at a hidden harbor in Ithaca. The crew gently lifted the sleeping hero, still on his linen sheet, and placed him on the sand, far from the main path. They then unloaded the immense treasure the Phaeacians had given him and piled it at the base of an olive tree. Then they departed. But the Phaeacians' good deed did not go unpunished. As their ship neared their home port, Poseidon, in a final act of rage, turned it to stone, sinking it in the harbor for all to see, a grim fulfillment of the old prophecy. When Odysseus awoke, he did not recognize his homeland. Athena had shrouded the island in a thick mist to conceal his arrival and to give her time to plan. He was filled with despair, believing the Phaeacians had betrayed him and left him on some unknown shore. It was then that Athena appeared, disguised as a young shepherd. She slowly revealed the truth to him, dispersing the mist and showing him the familiar landmarks of his home. Odysseus was overwhelmed with joy, kissing the soil of his native land. But Athena quickly turned his mind to the task at hand: vengeance. She told him of the suitors who had infested his palace, of their arrogance and their plots. They decided he must not reveal himself yet. He needed to test the loyalty of his household and plan his attack carefully. To do this, he needed a disguise. Athena touched him with her wand, and his transformation was startling. His skin withered, his hair fell out, his bright eyes dimmed. She dressed him in filthy rags. He became a stooped, wretched old beggar, unrecognizable to anyone. She then instructed him to go first to the hut of his swineherd, Eumaeus, a man she knew had remained deeply loyal to his long-lost master. While Odysseus went to the swineherd, Athena flew to Sparta to summon his son, Telemachus, home. Odysseus, in his beggar's disguise, was welcomed by the loyal Eumaeus. The swineherd, though he did not recognize his master, treated the stranger with kindness and hospitality, sharing his meager food and lamenting the loss of the great Odysseus and the wickedness of the suitors. Odysseus, in turn, tested him with stories, hinting that his master would soon return. The next day, Telemachus arrived back in Ithaca. Guided by Athena, he went directly to Eumaeus's hut. It was there, in that humble dwelling, that the reunion Odysseus had dreamed of for 20 years finally took place. Athena appeared and removed Odysseus's disguise, revealing him in his true form to his son. At first, Telemachus was stunned, thinking he was a god. But Odysseus convinced him, and they embraced, weeping in each other's arms after 2 decades of separation. The time for tears was short. They immediately began to plot their revenge. Odysseus would go to the palace, still disguised as a beggar, to observe the suitors and gauge the loyalty of the servants. Telemachus would return first and hide all the weapons that were hanging in the main hall. They were vastly outnumbered, just 2 men, with the help of the swineherd and perhaps a loyal oxherd, against more than 100 arrogant, violent young nobles. The stage was being set for a final, bloody confrontation. Odysseus, the master of strategy, was finally back on his home turf, ready to reclaim his kingdom with the same cunning and ruthlessness he had used to conquer Troy. Disguised once more as a wretched old beggar, Odysseus, accompanied by the loyal swineherd Eumaeus, made his way to his own palace. The scene that greeted him was one of loud, arrogant feasting. The suitors were carousing in his great hall, wasting his wealth. As he entered his own courtyard, an old dog, lying on a dung heap, lifted its head. It was Argos, the puppy Odysseus had trained himself 20 years ago, just before he left for Troy. The dog, now ancient and neglected, recognized his master's voice and presence, even through the disguise. He wagged his tail feebly, but was too weak to stand. A tear rolled down Odysseus's cheek as he saw his faithful dog, a living symbol of the long years he had lost. As soon as Odysseus entered the hall, Argos died, his long wait finally over. Inside the palace, Odysseus was met with scorn and cruelty. The suitors mocked the old beggar, refusing him food. Their leader, a violent and arrogant man named Antinous, even threw a footstool at him, striking him in the back. Odysseus endured the humiliation with a steely patience, his heart burning with a silent, calculated rage. Even his wife, Penelope, who came down to question the stranger for news of her husband, did not recognize him. He spoke to her, weaving a clever, fictional story about himself, but claiming to have met Odysseus years ago. He described Odysseus's appearance and clothes so accurately that Penelope wept. He then told her a final lie, that Odysseus was alive and would be home before the next new moon. Later, Penelope, showing kindness to the beggar, instructed his old nurse, Euryclea, to wash his feet. As the old woman bathed him, her hands traced a familiar scar on his thigh, a wound he had received from a boar's tusk during a hunt in his youth. Her eyes widened in recognition. She gasped, about to cry out his name, but Odysseus quickly silenced her, grabbing her by the throat and warning her to keep his secret or risk her own life. The day of reckoning arrived. Penelope, inspired by Athena, announced a contest for the suitors. She brought out the great bow of Odysseus, a weapon so powerful that only he had ever been able to string it. She declared that she would marry any man who could string the bow and shoot an arrow through the heads of 12 axes lined up in a row. One by one, the suitors tried and failed. They could not even bend the mighty bow. While they struggled, Odysseus revealed himself to his 2 most loyal servants, Eumaeus the swineherd and Philoetius the oxherd. They wept with joy and pledged their aid. The plan was in motion. Eumaeus was to give Odysseus the bow, and Philoetius was to lock the outer gates of the courtyard. After all the suitors had failed, Odysseus, still in his beggar's rags, humbly asked for a chance to try. The suitors roared with laughter and scorn, but Telemachus, asserting his authority, commanded that the beggar be given the bow. Odysseus took the weapon in his hands. He handled it with an expert's ease, effortlessly stringing it with a sound like the pluck of a harp. He then placed an arrow on the string, and without even rising from his seat, he drew it back and shot it cleanly through all 12 axe heads. The hall fell silent. At that moment, a thunderclap from Zeus echoed overhead. It was the signal. Odysseus threw off his rags. "The contest is over?" he said, his voice no longer that of a beggar, but of a king. "Now it is time for another kind of target." He knocked another arrow and shot Antinous through the throat as he was lifting a cup of wine. The suitor collapsed, dead. Panic erupted. The suitors, realizing who he was, scrambled for weapons, but Telemachus had hidden them all. The doors were locked. They were trapped. Odysseus, Telemachus, and their 2 loyal herdsmen stood against the terrified, unarmed mob. A bloody slaughter began. One by one, Odysseus and his allies cut down the suitors until the great hall was filled with their corpses, the floor running with rivers of blood. The 20-year journey had ended in a storm of violent, righteous vengeance.